The heat clung to Cedar Ridge like a curse that summer of 1887. Dust rose from the dry boards of the depot platform, drifting in lazy spirals across the main street. The little town had seen better days. Half the storefronts stood shuttered, their signs faded by sun and wind, and only the saloon and general store showed much life. But Ezekiel Thompson wasn't paying attention to any of that. He stood with his boots planted squarely on the weathered platform, eyes fixed on the western horizon, hands gripping a telegram he had read so many times that the ink was nearly worn away. It said only, "Arriving Tuesday train, ready to marry. Monsieur Whitmore." Today was Tuesday. The train would be arriving any minute. At 34, Ezekiel cut a striking figure despite the hard years that had carved lines into his face. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the build of a man who had spent his life behind a plow, a branding iron, or a rifle. His hair, once jet black, now showed the faintest streaks of gray at the temples, and his green eyes, Priscilla used to call them the color of new spring grass, had grown guarded and weary since her passing. 3 winters ago, pneumonia had taken her, along with most of his cattle, leaving Ezekiel alone to wrestle with debts, drought, and a silence in the house that pressed on him heavier than any saddle. The ranch still stood, though only barely. Fences needed mending, barns wanted paint, and a man couldn't run cattle, cook meals, and darn shirts all on his own. Loneliness gnawed at him like a wolf in the dark. That was when old Henrik Larsson, his nearest neighbor, had suggested what at first seemed unthinkable, a mail-order bride. "Plenty of women back east," Henrik had said, stroking his gray beard. "Widows, spinsters, good Christian girls looking for a chance at a new life. My cousin Magnus sent for one. 15 years of marriage and 5 children to show for it. Worked out fine for him." And so Ezekiel had taken pen to paper. His advertisement had been simple. "Widowed rancher in Montana Territory seeks respectable woman for marriage and companionship. Must be hard-working, God-fearing, and willing to assist with domestic duties." Serious inquiries only. He had received several responses, but one stood out among the rest. Millicent Whitmore, 26 years old, a seamstress by trade. She wrote with a careful, flowing hand about her desire to escape the crowded, sooty streets of Philadelphia, about her hope to build a quiet life far from the noise of the city. Her words had felt honest, steady, full of quiet dignity. Ezekiel had read her letter by lamplight so many times he nearly knew it by heart. She was coming west to be his wife, perhaps to help save his ranch, perhaps to help heal his heart. The wail of a whistle cut through his thoughts. Ezekiel's chest tightened as the black plume of smoke appeared, smudging the endless blue sky. The iron horse thundered closer, shaking the ground beneath the platform. A hiss of steam, a screech of metal on metal, and the train eased to a halt. Doors opened, and the conductor, Jeremiah Pike, stepped down to assist passengers. Familiar faces appeared, Mrs. Henderson returning from Denver, Barnaby Walsh, the salesman lugging his sample cases, 2 ranch hands Ezekiel recognized. Ezekiel's heart beat faster. Any moment now he would see Millicent Whitmore step onto the platform, and with her the promise of a different future. But no such woman appeared. Instead, the conductor reached up, steadying a much smaller figure. A child. A girl no more than 10, with honey-colored hair and neat braids, wearing a faded blue dress that had seen better days. She carried a carpet bag almost as large as herself and stepped onto the platform with a composure far too solemn for her years. Ezekiel frowned, certain the sun was playing tricks on him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. No, still a child. Still standing alone amid the bustle of departing passengers, scanning the crowd with wide brown eyes that seemed to hold equal parts fear and determination. And then she approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a clear, careful voice. Are you Mr. Ezekiel Thompson? For a moment, Ezekiel couldn't answer. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally managed, I am. But who are you, child? She extended a small hand with surprising formality. I'm Magnolia Whitmore. Most folks call me Maggie. I believe you were expecting me. The world tilted sideways. Ezekiel's first instinct was to laugh at the absurdity, but the solemnity of the girl's gaze stopped him cold. There must be some mistake, he said hoarsely. I arranged for a wife. Yes, sir, Maggie said matter-of-factly. I know. My Aunt Millicent was supposed to come, but she took sick with consumption 3 weeks ago. She passed on last Sunday. The words struck Ezekiel like a hammer blow. He stared at her, uncomprehending. Your aunt? Yes, sir. She was all the family I had left after Mama and Papa died in the fever last spring. Before she passed, Aunt Millicent made me promise to come in her place. She said you seemed like a good man from your letters and that maybe you could use some help around your ranch, even if it wasn't the kind you were expecting. Ezekiel looked around desperately as though Millicent might yet appear from another car, or some adult would step forward to claim the girl. But no one came. The platform emptied, passengers drifted away, and soon only Jeremiah Pike remained, preparing the train for departure. Child, Ezekiel said carefully, this isn't... I can't possibly. I was expecting a grown woman, not... Maggie lifted her chin, dignity shining through exhaustion. Begging your pardon, Mr. Thompson, but I've been taking care of myself and Aunt Millicent for months now. I can cook and clean and mend clothes. I'm stronger than I look, and I'm not afraid of hard work. The whistle blew again, warning of departure. Conductor Pike ambled over, tipping his cap. Everything all right here, Thompson? This little one belong to you? Ezekiel glanced down. Maggie's small hands gripped her carpetbag so tightly her knuckles were white. Her wide brown eyes looked up at him, filled with hope and defiance in equal measure, as if she were bracing herself for rejection but determined to face it with dignity. Ezekiel swallowed hard. What choice did he have? Put a 10-year-old girl back on the train to nowhere? Leave her stranded in a town she had never seen, with no family and no money? Despite his shock, something about her plain-spoken courage struck a chord deep inside him. He thought of Priscilla, how she had always wanted children, how they had prayed for them and never been blessed. Yes, Ezekiel heard himself say, surprising even his own ears. Yes, she's with me. Pike nodded and returned to the train. Moments later, the great iron machine huffed, groaned, and rolled away, leaving Ezekiel alone on the platform with his unexpected ward. Dust settled around them in the silence that followed. Maggie shifted awkwardly. I know this ain't what you planned, Mr. Thompson. If you want to send me on to the next town, I'll understand, but I promise you won't regret keeping me around. I'll earn my keep. The words wrenched Ezekiel's heart. She was a child, yet spoke with the resignation of someone who had already been tested by too much loss. He studied her face, the freckles, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the solemn eyes too old for her years, and thought of the empty rooms back at the ranch, the cold suppers of beans and coffee, the silence pressing in on him every night. Perhaps Providence had sent him not a bride, but something different, something he hadn't known he needed. He took a deep breath. Well then, he said gruffly, adjusting his hat to hide the sudden sting in his eyes. We'd best be getting home. It's a fair ride to the ranch. Relief flickered across Maggie's face, though she tried valiantly to hide it. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Ezekiel led her to his wagon where 2 sturdy horses, Thunder and Lightning, stood hitched and waiting. He helped her climb onto the wooden seat, her small boots barely reaching the floorboard, and stowed her carpetbag in the back. As he took the reins and clicked to the horses, Ezekiel stole a glance at the girl beside him. "Tell me about yourself, Maggie," he said as the wagon jolted forward. "Where did you come from?" "Philadelphia," she replied, sitting up straight despite her exhaustion. "Papa ran a boarding house there until he and Mama took sick. After they passed, I went to live with Aunt Millicent. She worked as a seamstress, but the consumption made her too weak toward the end. I did what I could." "And you cared for her?" "Yes, sir. I learned to cook and clean out of necessity. Aunt Millicent taught me to sew real fine, too. She said a woman should always have skills to fall back on." Ezekiel nodded slowly, impressed despite himself. He had expected a waif. Instead, he found a girl with grit and quiet pride, forged by hardship. "How old are you, child?" "I'll be 11 come October," she answered. "I know I'm small for my age, but I'm hardy. Never been sick a day in my life." They rode on in silence for a time, the wagon wheels creaking, hooves thudding against the parched earth. The wide Montana sky stretched above them, impossibly blue, dotted with hawks riding the thermals. At last Ezekiel pointed toward the distant silhouette of his ranch, the modest house with its sagging porch, the weathered barn, the acres of grassland lying fallow for want of cattle. "That's home," he said. Maggie studied the view with solemn eyes. "It looks like a good place. Peaceful." Peaceful, Ezekiel swallowed. Once it had been prosperous, too, but maybe, just maybe, peace and family mattered more than prosperity. And as the wagon rattled down the dusty road, Ezekiel realized with a start that his life had changed forever. Not with the arrival of a wife, but with the arrival of a daughter. The wagon jolted along the rutted track, wheels groaning with every bump. Maggie sat upright, clutching the seat with both hands, her chin held high, though her small body swayed with each lurch. Ezekiel stole glances at her as thunder and lightning pulled them steadily toward the Thompson ranch. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Somewhere a meadowlark called, and for the first time in months Ezekiel realized he wasn't listening to silence. There was someone beside him, someone breathing, talking, existing in his world. When they reached the rise that overlooked his spread, Ezekiel slowed the team. From the crest he could see everything: the weathered farmhouse with its wraparound porch, the barn with flaking red paint, a couple of outbuildings leaning slightly after too many storms. Fields stretched wide on either side, half choked with weeds where cattle once grazed. It wasn't much anymore, not compared to his neighbors, but it was still home. Maggie studied it carefully. "It looks solid," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe the barn needs paint, and the garden there could use tending." Ezekiel raised his brows. "You see all that already, do you?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "Aunt Millicent always said if you want to know a family, look at their house and their garden. A neat garden means someone cares about tomorrow." The words stung him more than he expected. He had let the garden go to weeds after Priscilla died, too broken to care whether tomorrow came or not. He gave the reins a flick, and the horses descended the slope toward the yard. Inside, the house smelled of dust and neglect. Ezekiel opened windows to let in fresh air, embarrassed suddenly by the bare walls and the absence of a woman's touch. Once Priscilla's hand had made this place feel alive. Embroidered curtains, flowers on the table, quilts draped across chairs. Now only the stone fireplace and a few sturdy pieces of furniture gave the place character. Maggie didn't complain. She wandered slowly through the rooms, her small hand trailing across surfaces. "It's clean," she said politely. "Much nicer than the tenement where Aunt and I lived." He cleared his throat. "It's plain, that's all. Never had the heart to change much since my wife passed." "I'm sorry," Maggie said softly, and for a moment the child looked much older than her years. Losing people you love is the hardest thing. Something in her tone made Ezekiel's throat tighten. This girl understood loss more than most grown men. He showed her upstairs to a spare room, small but cheerful, with a bed, chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the back pasture. It'll do until, well, it's yours now. He caught himself before saying nursery. The room that was supposed to have held the children he and Priscilla never had. It's perfect, Maggie said simply, setting her carpet bag on the bed. You can call me Ezekiel if you like, he said gruffly. Or Zeke, most folks do. She smiled faintly. I'd be honored, Zeke. Back downstairs, he tried to busy himself by stoking the stove. I suppose you're hungry. I've got beans, maybe some salt pork. Maggie's eyes widened in horror. Beans and fatback? That's no way for a man to live. If you've got potatoes, flour, maybe tomatoes, I can make a proper meal. Ezekiel chuckled. I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook. Then let me, she said firmly, already rolling up her sleeves. Despite his protests that she must be tired from her journey, Maggie set to work with the quiet competence of someone who had been managing kitchens longer than her age suggested. She sliced potatoes with quick, sure strokes, seasoned the pork, and soon the kitchen was filled with the aroma of sizzling food. Ezekiel sat at the table watching, astonished. She moved around his kitchen as though she had been born to it. When supper was ready, Ezekiel tasted the first real meal he'd eaten in months. The salt pork was crisp, the potatoes golden, the biscuits fluffy. He set down his fork, shaking his head in wonder. This is the best food I've had since... His voice faltered, but Maggie finished for him gently. Since your wife? Yes, he admitted. Maggie's smile was small but proud. Aunt Millicent always said food is how you show people you care. Later they sat on the porch as the evening cooled. The sky darkened into velvet, pricked with stars brighter than Maggie had ever seen in Philadelphia. A coyote howled in the distance. She listened without fear, her eyes wide. Zeke, she said after a long silence. I know this isn't what you wanted. If you want to send me to the next town, I'll understand, but I promise I'll earn my keep. He looked at her, at the small frame too stubborn to bow under life's weight, at the bravery etched in her young face. And he thought of Priscilla again, how she had longed for children. You won't need to earn your keep, he said slowly. You're family now. That's enough. The words caught Maggie off guard. Her eyes glistened, and she turned quickly toward the dark yard so he wouldn't see. Thank you, she whispered. The next morning, Ezekiel woke to the smell of bacon and coffee. He padded downstairs to find Maggie bustling in the kitchen, humming under her breath. Pancakes were stacked high, eggs frying in the pan. I wanted to show you I meant what I said, she told him cheerfully. I can keep this house running. Ezekiel sat heavily, shaking his head in disbelief. Maggie, you don't have to prove anything. You're not hired help. He paused, then said softly, Your family. She froze, her back to him, then continued stirring with a little tremor in her shoulders. That's real nice to hear, she said in a small voice. After breakfast, he gave her the grand tour of the ranch. The barn held his 2 horses and a tired milk cow named Bessie. The chicken coop stood mostly empty. The vegetable garden lay smothered in weeds. This land could be real productive again, Maggie observed seriously. The soil looks rich. If you've got seeds, I can tend it while you work the cattle. Her certainty surprised him. Maybe so, he admitted. Down at the creek, she knelt to splash her face with the cold water. It's beautiful here, she said. So different from the city. I don't mind the lonesome. I've been lonesome most of my life anyway. The confession pierced him. She deserved laughter, games, the carefree days of childhood, not endless chores and grief. But perhaps here she could find a little of that lost childhood again. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ezekiel stood on the porch and watched Maggie chase a stray chicken across the yard, her braids flying. For the first time since Priscilla's death, he felt something stirring inside him. Something that looked suspiciously like hope. But word traveled fast in small towns, and gossip was quicker than wildfire. By the following Saturday, Willow Creek was buzzing. Folks expected to see Ezekiel return with a wife. Instead, he arrived with a girl who called him Uncle Zeke. Bertha Morrison, owner of the general store, cornered them the moment they stepped inside. "Well, Ezekiel Thompson," she exclaimed, peering down at Maggie. "Who is this lovely young lady?" Ezekiel kept his voice steady. "My niece, Magnolia. She's come to live with me after her parents passed." Bertha's sharp eyes softened. "You poor dear. But how wonderful you have your uncle to look after you." "Yes, ma'am," Maggie replied politely, the perfect picture of composure. "Uncle Ezekiel has been very kind." Ezekiel marveled at how naturally she carried the deception. For now it was the safest story. Let folks think she was kin, family. Still, whispers followed them out of the store, questions hanging in the hot summer air. And in the shadows across the street, Ezekiel noticed a stranger watching. A man with cold gray eyes who vanished before Ezekiel could get a better look. Something told him this new life with Maggie was about to face its first real test. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ezekiel hadn't known he'd been craving. At dawn, he rose to the smell of coffee already percolating and bacon sizzling in the skillet. Maggie moved about the kitchen like she had been born to it, humming as she flipped flapjacks, pouring coffee with both grace and efficiency. "You don't need to work yourself so hard, child," Ezekiel told her one morning, watching as she set a plate of eggs before him. "I'm not working hard," she said brightly. "I'm working smart. If you're fed proper, you'll work better. And if I keep the house clean and the garden growing, you can focus on the cattle." Ezekiel chuckled, shaking his head. "You sound like a wife twice your age, Maggie." She beamed. "That's what Aunt Millicent always told me. Run a household like a ship and no storm will sink you." Mid-August, the ranch was already changing under Maggie's hand. The garden, once choked with weeds, now stood in neat rows of beans, squash, and tomatoes. She had mended torn curtains, scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, even managed to coax the old henhouse back into production. One afternoon, Ezekiel returned from repairing fences to find Maggie kneeling in the yard, a ledger open on her lap, pencil moving briskly. "What are you up to there?" he asked, curious. "Keeping accounts," she said without looking up. "We need to know what comes in and what goes out if we're ever going to get ahead." Ezekiel laughed. "Since when do 11-year-olds keep ledgers?" "Since the day they have to," she answered simply. That night she showed him his own books, reorganized with neat, careful columns. She had found arithmetic errors in his calculations and pointed out that they could sell extra produce to the Morrisons at the general store. When she slid a small jar of coins across the table, earnings she had already collected, Ezekiel was too stunned to speak. "You been selling our vegetables?" he finally managed. "Only the surplus," Maggie said, her chin lifting defensively. "Mrs. Morrison pays fair, and I put every penny aside for the ranch." Ezekiel stared at her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed. "Maggie Thompson, you're full of surprises." She flushed with pride. "I told you I could help." The town, however, wasn't as quick to accept their unusual arrangement. On Sundays, they rode into Willow Creek for church, and though Reverend Hutchkins welcomed Maggie warmly, Ezekiel could feel eyes boring into his back as they slid into a pew. "That Thompson," he heard someone whisper, "ordered himself a bride and came back with a girl." "Odd business, that," another murmured. "Mark my words, it'll end in trouble." After service, Bertha Morrison, never one to hold her tongue, cornered Ezekiel on the church steps. "She's a sweet child, Ezekiel," Bertha said with a knowing smile. "But folks are wondering, where exactly did she come from?" "My niece," Ezekiel said smoothly, repeating the story they'd agreed upon. "From Philadelphia. Her parents passed, and I couldn't leave her to fend for herself." Bertha's sharp eyes lingered on him for a moment, then softened. "Well, God bless you for taking her in. She looks happier already." Maggie, standing straight as a soldier at his side, offered her brightest smile. "Thank you, ma'am. Uncle Zeke has been very kind." That seemed to satisfy most, but Ezekiel knew whispers would continue. In towns like Willow Creek, gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and suspicions smoldered long after the flames. One hot July afternoon, as Ezekiel was repairing a corral gate, Maggie came running from the house, skirts flying. "Zeke, someone's riding up the road." Ezekiel wiped sweat from his brow and squinted into the shimmering heat. A lone rider approached on a fine bay horse, his coat cut in the Eastern style, his posture too stiff to belong to a cowboy. As he drew closer, Ezekiel saw a man in his 40s with cold gray eyes and an expression that carried more calculation than courtesy. The stranger dismounted with practiced ease. "Mr. Thompson, I presume?" "That's right," Ezekiel said cautiously. "What can I do for you?" "My name is Chester Whitmore," the man replied, smoothing dust from his coat. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Maggie gasped, her small hand clutching Ezekiel's sleeve. Ezekiel's stomach dropped. "Whitmore, I'm not sure I understand," Ezekiel said, his voice careful. Whitmore's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Magnolia, my late sister's daughter. She disappeared from Philadelphia after her aunt's passing, and I've been searching for her ever since." "She's my niece," Ezekiel said firmly. "She came west to live with me after her parents died." Whitmore chuckled, the sound humorless. "Your niece? That's an interesting claim. Magnolia is my niece, and as her closest living relative, her rightful guardian. There's also the matter of her inheritance." Ezekiel felt Maggie stiffen beside him. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "She's happy here, thriving, and she'll stay that way." Whitmore's gray eyes narrowed. "You've no legal right to her, Thompson. Blood speaks louder than sentiment. I've already spoken with the sheriff. If you don't hand her over willingly, the law will compel you." Maggie's voice cut through the tension, clear and trembling. "I won't go with you, Uncle Chester. This is my home now." Whitmore's smile vanished. "We'll see what the judge has to say about that." He mounted his horse, tipped his hat mockingly, and rode off in a cloud of dust. Ezekiel's hand lingered on Maggie's shoulder. "Don't worry, child. He won't take you without a fight." But even as he spoke, Ezekiel knew Whitmore wasn't bluffing. The man had papers, money, and the law on his side. Ezekiel had only his word, and his growing love for the girl who had stumbled into his life. For that evening they sat on the porch, one silence heavy between them. Maggie's eyes were dark with worry. "He's lying," she burst out finally. "He only wants my inheritance. Aunt Millicent warned me. He gambled away all his money, and now he wants mine. If he gets control of me, he'll waste it all." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "Then we won't let him. The judge will see you're better off here." "But what if he doesn't?" Maggie whispered. Ezekiel stared out across the darkening fields. Then he turned to her, his voice steady. "What would you think about me adopting you, Maggie?" making you my daughter in the eyes of the law, not just in our hearts." Her eyes widened. "Could you do that?" "I can try," Ezekiel said. "Judge Whitfield owes me a favor. If we can prove Whitmore abandoned you and that you're better off here, we might stand a chance." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes, but her voice was fierce. "I'd like that more than anything. You're more of a father to me than anyone's ever been." Ezekiel pulled her close, her small frame fitting against his side as though it had always belonged there. "Then we'll fight this, together." Above them, the Montana sky flamed with stars. In the distance, a wolf howled, and though danger was closing in, Ezekiel felt a certainty deep in his chest. Whatever storms lay ahead, he and Maggie would weather them side by side. The heat of late August pressed down like a heavy blanket, and the town of Willow Creek buzzed with tension. Word had spread. Chester Whitmore, the Easterner with the fine clothes and colder eyes, was demanding custody of young Maggie. Folks had seen the showdown at Ezekiel's ranch, and now they whispered on porches and in the saloon. Some wondered if the law would side with blood. Others hoped the judge would see reason. Ezekiel spent nights at the kitchen table, Maggie beside him, papers spread across the worn wood. He had scraped together every coin from his savings to hire a lawyer out of Helena, a sharp man named William Carter with a reputation for cutting through bluster. "You understand, Thompson," Carter said gravely during their first meeting. "Whitmore's got the advantage on paper. Birth certificates, death certificates, guardianship letters, all Eastern issued. The judge can't ignore those. What we have to prove is intent and fitness, that Whitmore doesn't care for the child's welfare, only her inheritance. And that you, despite not being kin, are the better guardian." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "I don't just care for her, I love her. She's mine in every way that matters." Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then we'll make the court see it." The day of the hearing, the town's small courthouse was packed. Farmers, ranchers, merchants, every seat filled, and more stood outside, straining to hear through the open windows. Maggie sat at the front beside Ezekiel, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, though her eyes betrayed her nerves. Whitmore arrived in a fine carriage, his coat pressed, papers tucked in a leather folio. He looked around the courtroom with thinly veiled disdain, as though the dusty frontier town were beneath him. Judge Whitfield, a broad man with a lined face and the kind of authority earned by decades on the bench, banged his gavel. "This court will come to order. We are here to determine the guardianship of Magnolia Whitmore, age 11. Mr. Whitmore, you may state your claim." Chester rose smoothly, bowing slightly. "Your Honor, I am the child's blood uncle, her only living relative. When her parents died, guardianship rightfully fell to me. Unfortunately, the girl ran away before I could bring her into my home. I have documentation, birth and death certificates, letters of guardianship, all legal and binding. I only wish to reclaim what is mine, my niece and her future." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ezekiel clenched his fists, but Carter placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," the judge said. "Mr. Thompson, your response?" Carter rose. "Your Honor, while Mr. Whitmore is indeed bloodkin, we intend to prove that he has no interest in Magnolia's welfare. His sudden appearance coincides suspiciously with knowledge of her inheritance, an estate left by her late parents. Furthermore, Mr. Whitmore made no effort to care for the child for over a year. In that time, she has been thriving in the care of Ezekiel Thompson, a man of this community whose devotion is proven by witness and deed. We will ask this court to approve Mr. Thompson's petition to adopt Magnolia as his legal daughter." The judge's brows rose. Adoption was rare on the frontier, but not unheard of. "Proceed," he said. One by one, townsfolk took the stand. Bertha Morrison testified first. That child came into my store neat, polite, and bright-eyed. I've seen her help Mr. Thompson manage accounts better than most grown men. And she's been selling vegetables she grew herself. Honest work, honest earnings. She belongs here. Reverend Hutchkins followed. Magnolia attends church regular, reads scripture with clarity beyond her years, and shows a hunger for learning. More importantly, I've seen the bond between her and Mr. Thompson. It is not convenience. It is family. Even old Henrik Larson, Ezekiel's neighbor, leaned heavily on his cane as he swore. That girl has brought life back to Thompson's place. I seen him near broken after his wife died. Now he's standing tall again. If that ain't proof she belongs with him, I don't know what is. Carter turned to Maggie herself. Magnolia, do you wish to speak? The courtroom held its breath as the small girl rose, her braids trembling slightly. She faced the judge with dignity. Your Honor, she said, voice clear though soft. I know I'm just a child, but I know what it feels like to be unwanted. Uncle Chester didn't come for me when Ma and Pa died. He didn't come when Aunt Millicent passed. He only came when he learned I had money. Mr. Thompson, Zeke. He didn't ask for me either. But when I stepped off that train alone, he didn't turn me away. He gave me a home. He gave me family. That's where I want to stay. Tears shone in more than a few eyes. Whitmore's lawyer sputtered objections, but the judge held up a hand. The child's preference is duly noted. Whitmore himself finally took the stand. Under Carter's sharp questioning, his polished composure began to crack. Mr. Whitmore, how much money is in the child's estate? Approximately $10,000, Whitmore admitted reluctantly. And your personal finances? That is none of... Answer the question. Whitmore's lips thinned. I have debts. Investments gone sour, but that has nothing to do with my guardianship. On the contrary, Carter pressed them, it has everything to do with it. You intend to use the child's inheritance to pay your debts. Isn't it true you even considered marrying her off young to one of your associates to settle those debts? Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Whitmore's face flushed, his composure shattered. Outrageous lies! But the damage was done. The judge's face had hardened. After a brief recess, Judge Whitfield returned. The courtroom rose, then settled. This has been a difficult case, he began. The law respects blood ties, but the law also respects the welfare of the child. It is clear to this court that Mr. Whitmore's interest lies not in his niece's well-being, but in her inheritance. By contrast, Mr. Thompson has provided her with a stable home, education, and, most importantly, love. He banged his gavel once. Therefore, the petition for adoption is granted. Magnolia Whitmore shall henceforth be known as Magnolia Thompson, the lawful daughter of Ezekiel Thompson, with all rights and protections therein. The room erupted in applause. Maggie burst into tears and threw her arms around Ezekiel's neck. He held her tight, whispering, You're mine now, officially and forever. Whitmore stormed from the courtroom, vowing appeals, but his lawyer quietly advised him no higher court would overturn such a clear decision. That evening, Ezekiel and Maggie sat on the porch of the ranch watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. How does it feel to be Magnolia Thompson? Ezekiel asked gently. Maggie leaned against him, her face glowing despite tear tracks. It feels like coming home, even though I've been home all along. Ezekiel slipped an arm around her shoulders. From the moment you stepped off that train, you were family. I'll never regret it. She tilted her head to look at him. Do you ever wish it had turned out different? That Aunt Millicent had come instead. Ezekiel thought of the lonely house, the empty fields, the ache in his heart before Maggie arrived. He shook his head slowly. Never. Not for a single moment. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Maggie smiled through fresh tears. We saved each other, didn't we? That's what families do, he replied. As the stars came out, father and daughter sat in quiet contentment, knowing the hardest battle was behind them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer by accident, but by choice, by law, and by love. Autumn settled over Willow Creek like a gentle quilt, cooling the parched land after a brutal summer. Golden cottonwoods lined the creek bed, and the first frosts painted silver on the pasture grass. For the first time in years, Ezekiel's ranch felt alive. The garden Maggie had tended all summer overflowed with pumpkins, squash, and carrots. Chickens clucked in the yard again, thanks to Maggie convincing Ezekiel to barter for a half-dozen hens in town. The barn, once empty and echoing, now held the beginnings of a small cattle herd. It wasn't prosperity yet, but it was a foundation. And at the center of it all was Maggie, her laughter and determination filling every empty corner Ezekiel hadn't realized was starved for light. The first snow came early that year. Ezekiel and Maggie spent a long afternoon stacking firewood by the porch and hanging thick curtains to keep out the drafts. That night, with snow swirling outside, they sat by the fire roasting chestnuts. Maggie's new surname was already embroidered neatly in the corner of a quilt she had been working on. "Feels like we've always been the Thompsons," she said, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. Ezekiel smiled, handing her a steaming mug of cider. "That's because we have. Paper didn't make it true. The judge just gave the world permission to see what we already knew." Maggie sipped her drink, thoughtful. "Reverend Hutchkins says sometimes God answers prayers in ways we don't expect. Maybe I prayed for a home, and he sent me to you. Maybe you prayed for family, and he sent you me." Ezekiel felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're wise beyond your years, child," she grinned. "You keep saying that. Maybe I just listen better than most." Christmas of 1887 brought more joy than Ezekiel thought possible. He hadn't celebrated much since Priscilla's passing, but Maggie insisted. Together they cut a cedar tree from the far pasture, hauled it home on the wagon, and decorated it with strings of popcorn and bright ribbons. On Christmas mornings, Ezekiel presented her with a small wrapped package. Inside lay a silver locket, carefully polished, with room for 2 tiny photographs. On one side, he had placed the only surviving photograph of her parents he'd managed to acquire from Reverend Hutchkins' connections back east. On the other, a freshly taken portrait of the 2 of them. Ezekiel seated, Maggie standing proudly beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Her eyes filled with tears. "Zeke, it's perfect." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his calloused thumb. "Now you'll always carry both your families with you, where you came from and where you belong now." Maggie hugged him fiercely. "Thank you, Pa." The word stopped him cold. Pa. He hadn't heard it in years and never directed at him. Slowly, reverently, he returned the embrace. "Merry Christmas, daughter." Winter passed in quiet contentment. Maggie devoured books from Reverend Hutchkins, asking endless questions that stretched Ezekiel's mind. In return, he taught her ranch skills: how to mend tack, how to spot signs of illness in cattle, how to ride with confidence. By spring, she was handling her pony like she'd been born to the saddle. When they rode into town for supplies, people noticed the change. Maggie had grown taller, her cheeks rosy from fresh air and good food. Ezekiel carried himself with new pride, no longer the hollow-eyed widower, but a father with a purpose. Bertha Morrison leaned over her store counter one morning, eyeing the pair with uncharacteristic softness. You've done right by that girl, Ezekiel. She shines brighter every time I see her. She's the one doing right by me, Ezekiel replied. She gave me back my life. But life in the Montana Territory was never without shadows. One afternoon, while Ezekiel and Maggie were repairing fence along the north pasture, Henrik Larson rode up, his horse lathered with sweat. "Zeke," he called urgently, "word is there's a band of rustlers working their way through the valley. Took 20 head from the Harris place last week, armed and mean." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. The herd he had started rebuilding was small but precious. Losing even a handful could set them back years. Maggie's eyes widened. "What will we do?" "We'll do what ranchers always do," Ezekiel said grimly. "Keep watch, stay ready, and protect what's ours." That night, as Maggie sat by the fire pretending to read but sneaking worried glances at him, Ezekiel made her a quiet promise. "Don't fret, child. We've faced worse storms. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." She nodded slowly. "I'm not afraid if you're with me." Spring blossomed into a new era for the Thompsons. Reverend Hutchkin suggested starting a small school for the children scattered around Willow Creek. Ezekiel surprised Maggie by offering their ranch as the first meeting place. "You've got the brains in this family," he told her with a grin. "Might as well share some of it with the neighbors." Maggie laughed, but her eyes shone with pride. "A school on the ranch? That'd be wonderful. I could help teach the little ones their letters." The idea took root quickly. Families began talking, plans were drawn, and soon children were gathering twice a week under the wide branches of the cottonwood tree near the creek. Maggie standing at the front with chalk in hand. Ezekiel watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. She wasn't just his daughter, she was becoming a light for the whole community. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains, Maggie asked softly, "Do you ever think about the day I stepped off that train?" "Every day," Ezekiel admitted. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd said no, if I'd let you walk away." "You wouldn't have," Maggie said firmly. "I knew it when I looked in your eyes. You were meant to be my pa." Ezekiel gazed out across the land, the modest ranch that was coming back to life, the fields waiting for cattle, the house glowing with warmth it hadn't known in years. "Maybe that's the lesson," he said slowly. "Sometimes life gives us what we need, not what we planned. And if we're brave enough to accept it, it can change everything." Maggie leaned against him, her locket glinting in the fading light. "I think Aunt Millicent knew that. She said you seemed like a good man in your letters." "She was right." Ezekiel swallowed hard, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "If she could see us now, I think she'd be proud." The stars pricked the sky, coyotes yipped in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of sage across the valley. Father and daughter sat in silence, wrapped in the unspoken promise of a future built not on chance, but on choice. There would be hardships ahead, cattle rustlers, hard winters, the endless work of the land. But there would also be joy, laughter, learning, and the steady bond of a family forged in fire and faith. The Thompson Ranch, once a place of sorrow, now pulsed with new life. And though the world might still whisper about the strange twist of fate that had brought Maggie to that platform on a hot summer day, Ezekiel knew the truth. She hadn't been a mistake. She had been a blessing. And together they would ride out whatever storms the Montana frontier had left to throw at them.